Trust? What if I told you to stop trusting everyone you think is smart? Obviously, this is never going to happen because trusting others is something we do without a second thought. We trust our teachers to help us learn, just like we trust our Uber drivers to take us to our destinations. But what we often worry about is trusting ourselves, specifically trusting our instincts. But what if that instinct was the one thing that could help you more than anything? But you would never know this because you doubted your own ability to identify and tackle the problems you face. Now, I'm sure you may be thinking, Kennedy, I don't know what you're talking about, and you sound pretty dramatic. I'm sure you all believe that you could trust yourself over other people's words pretty easily. But in reality, the trust we give ourselves is often situational. Like if your dad told you how to do a math problem, and you weren't sure if you were correct or not, but he learned how to do the content 30 years ago, and you learned how to do it 2 weeks ago. So it would be easy for you to believe that you are situationally smarter. But you wouldn't usually go around challenging his work and educational experience with your astounding middle school degree. Think about it. We tend to not believe our instincts if the people we look up to tell us no. And we neglect these internal monologues based on these people's perceptions of how we act. In fact, this is so common that psychologist Stanley Milgram created a name for it: authority bias. Basically, we are socially conditioned to obey authority figures based on the increased likelihood for survival because they tend to have more knowledge and experience than us. It seems reasonable at face value, but in reality, these superiors do not always know what they're talking about. They cannot always predict the most optimal outcomes, and they do not always know what's best for us. Despite this, we do not trust ourselves because the idea that these superiors are wrong seems so much less likely than the possibility that we are wrong. However, our instincts are incredibly powerful at telling us when something isn't right. And it is time for you to start trusting that instinct, because that trust changed my life, and it might change yours. Now, before I continue on with my talk, I have been saying the word instinct a lot, but I haven't actually explained it for you. So here's a quick debrief. According to the American Psychology Association, a person's instinct is their intuitive way of acting or thinking, prompted by our genetics and our environment. And the region of our brain that controls our instincts also controls our subconscious responses and our pain, which means these things are connected. And this connection is super important because it means that the perception of our problems and the impact they have on our lives is dependent upon these instincts that acknowledge our pain and allow us to validate that something is wrong. And tons of instincts can appear across 3 different categories, those being self-preservation, social engagement, and attraction. But even famous philosophers like Karl Marx have ignored this phenomenon, labeling instincts as shallow and hard to interpret. But as discovered by Mark Abraham, this researcher on the causes of perpetual human conflict, when you ignore your instincts, you can impair your intelligence, hinder your happiness, and ignore real issues in your life. Consider this. How many times have you ignored an instinct of yours and been fully satisfied with the result? And I'm not just talking about that feeling you get when you're trying to guess on the multiple choice section of your exams, but real life issues. And this issue only continues when your role models and advisors dismiss these beliefs of yours, convincing you not to trust it. In fact, I fell into this trap. As a kid, I complained a lot after running, and I walked funny after playing sports. And I like to say the words, "My knees hurt a lot." I played the statement off as lighthearted, never pushing harder than a, maybe we should see the doctor. But it was my 11-year-old way of saying, hey, Mom and Dad, I am really hurting. I looked up to them for an answer, but I wasn't looking to the right adults because they also didn't know what was going on, only sure of the fact that they did not want to believe that their daughter was always in pain. And so, my self-doubt about my pain being my imagination was validated. My parents often saying, it's probably growing pains. You'll grow out of it. And this idea continued when we explored some options, like poor balance and instability, where my brain was scanned and I went to physical therapy. But nothing changed, because this was not the right answer. And so for years, this idea of growing pains was believable. It was my life. And so I went on, and I stopped talking about it so much, as I lost sight of the real problem. But the truth is, I allowed myself to be convinced of a reality where my issue did not exist. And I only let myself be convinced of this because I believed the people conveying these ideas were 10 times smarter than me. I was a first-hand example of authority bias. But love and good intent from these people did not equate to solutions, and we were all way off the mark. In fact, it took me 7 years of chronic pain to get diagnosed. And finally, after getting x-rays and MRI scans, we had a doctor check out the bones in my knee area. And even before looking at the scans, I distinctly remember her telling me, it's probably a muscular imbalance in your legs, which is great because we can fix this easily. But when the scans were pulled up, her face changed, a little less enthusiastic now, and my instincts finally became true to everyone, not just me. I was diagnosed with multifocal osteochondral dissecant lesions with a component of a vascular necrosis. In simpler terms, I was diagnosed with a condition where the bone underneath the cartilage in my knee joints had died and was decomposing due to lack of blood flow. And you can see that decomposing bit in the little red circle on the screen. This was a little different than me being pretty clumsy and imbalanced or not having super strong legs. And although we explored some possibilities, my parents and I avoided these extreme scenarios because no parent wants to believe that their child is really struggling. And I believed my parents. And I recognize that this issue is not something most people can relate to, but when the people you look up to convey an assumption or bias about you, whether it be your parents or the influencers you watch on social media, it can be extremely difficult to actualize your own problem. And especially when we are young and impressionable, it can be really easy for us to have our thoughts reflect what we're told. And even easier for us to label these experiences as temporary and unconcerning. But it isn't only problematic that I allowed myself to be convinced to ignore my instincts, but I didn't fight hard enough for them. Going back to that idea of blind trust in our mentors, I was so quick to allow the words of my parents, coaches, and doctors to become dominant in our conversations. I became nervous that my complaints were annoying, as they had already given me answers. And so, for years, I did not push for solutions. But I strongly believe that if I could have better advocated for myself, I would have been able to get help quicker, saving a lot of pain down the road. So it is the times when we are not being listened to that we need to persist, emphasizing the impact of our experiences on our lives, because we are the only ones facing the consequences. Whether it be reaching out to someone else or communicating in a different way, sometimes even these small adaptations can create big changes. And that positive change is always worth it. All it took for me to get help was to communicate my problem in a different way. That's it, detailing the full extent of my problem. And I couldn't be more grateful because now I can live a life without pain. Ultimately, allowing yourself to be convinced of biases and invalidating your experiences prevents you from finding out what could be. So knowing the value of your experience on your life is the most valuable tool you have at your disposal, because what you feel matters more than what you are told. As Steve Jobs said, don't let the noise of others drown your inner voice. The next time your instinct tells you something's wrong, trust it, ask questions, seek second opinions, and don't let anyone dismiss your voice. So remember this, trust your instincts, because in a world full of opinions, sometimes only you know what's right. Thank you.